Welcome to the Great Reboot. I'm Tori Ryden. Wow, what a 3 months it has been. It's been 3 months here in America anyway, since we've been in lockdown. And full disclosure, our guest actually was a guest way back in March here on the Great Reboot, but that was prior to social distancing. And so we thought rather than air that, and it would be kind of awkward having him right next to me, we thought we'd bring him in, and now seems to be really the best time to have Jim Bouchard, Sensei Leader, Black Belt Leadership, our friend. Jim, I want to welcome you back to the Great Reboot, and I don't know what to say other than, wow, what a crazy 3 months this has been.
Yeah, and I miss being in the room with you. I mean, seriously, you know, I'm a hugs and handshakes person, and this has been quite an adjustment the last few months. But hopefully things are coming back a little bit right now. We just got to stay on track with it. Yeah.
You know, not and this is not a political show at all, but I think I cannot kind of ignore and avoid what is going on here in America. And you know, I've got friends, as you do, all around the globe, who have been sending emails saying, what is going on there? And I feel so bad for you. And people are wondering if we're alive. I mean, the whole vision of what's going on in America has the world gripped. And so again, I don't want to talk politics, but I do want to say, this is a throwback to so many different periods in history, isn't it? You know, we're feeling the 60s, we're feeling this wholesale lack of leadership. We are feeling, where's the compassion? And yet you're seeing the compassion spilling out in the streets. It's just this total dichotomy. And so, you know, let's get started, Jim. I mean, you're all about leadership. You're all about helping people to take a step forward, to be the leaders. And I know that this past 3 months, you've probably been busier than ever because you've been holding a lot of, you know, online meetings, a lot of Zoom, and, you know, really getting some important leaders together and growing leaders. So let's talk about that. What have you been up to, Jim Bouchard?
Well, you know, the upside of that is exactly what you just said. We've been hearing a lot of the positive side of it, right? And we've been networking with leaders who are really doing amazing things, taking advantage of this uncertainty. That's one of the themes that we've been working on pretty diligently over the last few weeks. One of the most popular themes we work on is, you know, how do we get opportunity out of uncertainty? How do we become comfortable with uncertainty so we're able to find that opportunity? And there are a lot of leaders that are doing that. You know that I mean leaders at all levels. I'm not talking about any rank, title, or position of authority. People that see what needs doing and they do it. People who take the initiative, people who are innovative and creative. Now, at the same time, in a situation like this, we really can't avoid the politics, because politics is how we govern ourselves. You know, people like to say, oh, we can't talk politics. Well, try to avoid it. I mean, we live in a society where allegedly we self-govern, and politics is the means, and it's nasty sometimes, it's filthy sometimes. But the threat of it, and I have to say this, the deficiency that I'm seeing in political leadership right now, largely, and this can happen in business and family leadership too, so we have to pay attention to it, is the lack of listening, the lack of engagement. You know, edicts being issued from isolated places, right? Leaders who are insulating themselves, that are surrounding themselves with people who are confirming their own biases. And I don't mean that in the worst possible way. We're all susceptible to that. I call it the authoritarian slip. We've got to be open. We've got to sit down. And just before we came on, my dear friend John Hansen shared this wonderful story from Wichita, where there was an Antifa rally that was scheduled to be held. And the police chief invited those folks to sit down with them. They agreed on a barbecue, of all things. Now, some people criticized that. They said it was a trite move. They were buying them off and things like that. But no, what a wonderful idea. And they actually sat down this past Sunday, and the police chief and other officials just listened. Now, that doesn't mean they agree, doesn't mean they condone the behaviors of some of the folks that are rioting and looting. What it meant is that they were willing to reach out to the people, right, who really pose the greatest threat to them. And that's what great leadership is all about. I thought, I was so moved by that story. I'm glad I found it this morning. I really needed that. Yeah.
Well, I want to share with you something that's very similar to this, and it is political. It is It is one of Maine's great senators. I'll say that. I think he's done a lot for the state of Maine, Senator Angus King. And what he has done, and it's interesting, I interviewed him for another podcast that I did, Positively Maine, which you've been on. And, he told me that what he does is, because the divide in Washington is so severe, he intentionally reaches across to those who are most hostile on each side. And he invites them to a barbecue at his place in Georgetown. And they sit down, they break bread. It's the old fashioned, if we're going to argue, let's do this, but let's do it over a meal. But at least let's choose to agree to disagree, and that's part of, politics anyway, but in a gentlewomanly manner, which it sounds very similar to what you're talking about in Kansas.
Well, it is. In spirit of full disclosure, it's funny, we got to know Senator King very well when he was Governor King, and he and his wife Mary became friends. They were wonderful people. We actually taught their son Ben martial arts. That's how we got to know them. So really admire those folks. They're good folks. Don't always agree politically, and that's the thing that should take place. I'm a history junkie. The founders purposely, and you read this in Madison, you read this in Franklin, you read this in Jefferson. They set up a purposely adversarial system because ideas need to compete, right? And sometimes they get nasty, but you're right. I mean, in the old days, it's awful for us to be saying that type of thing. But I remember reading Tip O'Neill talking about Blackie's Steakhouse in D.C. and how right after the sessions, they'd be yelling and screaming at each other. For sure, they're passionate. You want people to be passionate. In fact, there's no good ideas that come out of complacency, right? Right. The thing is, you don't, and I wish I could remember this gentleman's name. There's somebody who was doing, it was a conference I spoke at, and this gentleman actually used to facilitate retreats with Democrats and Republicans in Congress. And very interesting, because he said for good ideas to move forward, you don't want the temperature to be too cool. You don't want the temperature to be too hot, right? But he emphasized you don't want it to be too cool either, right? Because you want ideas to compete. Now I'll take that a little further. And in a lot of the work that we do, a lot of the workshops we facilitate, we'll find often if there's two competing ideas, and the most difficult are not the right versus wrong ideas. They're the right versus right ideas. You might have an idea and you feel passionately you've got the right way. I might feel passionately I have the right way. And what we find, if we can dialogue constructively, and like I said, it doesn't necessarily mean without passion, even anger sometimes, but with respect and with a constructive heart, then a third idea usually emerges. And it has bits and pieces of each of our ideas, right? But there's usually something else that neither of us considered independently. And then we also have to agree to put aside the points where there's just absolute disagreement. We can still work with each other. We can still live with each other. We can still love one another, right? I don't know of any relationship, marriage or partnership or otherwise, where people are in total agreement, not a healthy one. You know what I mean?
That's true. That's true.
So it's to find those areas we should be working together and to put aside those areas where we cannot find agreement for some reason.
But what you're talking about, Jim, kind of to your point, requires listening, but it also requires courage. And what we're seeing right now, and when you mentioned earlier about isolation and kind of insular, that to me, when you were speaking, all of a sudden I think if somebody's in isolation and kind of operating in an insulated way, it means there's fear, and that they're leading by fear.
It can be, and it's very often, it's interesting because you know me, so in spirit of full disclosure, I can be a very judgmental person. And I've had to learn in my work to put that judgment aside. I've had to discipline myself to put that judgment aside when we're analyzing these. So I hope people understanding this is not a political statement that I'm going to make right now. I hate the fact that I have to make that disclaimer, but it's necessary. And I've been very critical of some of the governors lately. And for that reason you just mentioned. But I understand the reason, okay? They want to avoid greater conflict. They sometimes are protecting turf and territory, and especially if they're in an election cycle. That's a difficult position too, right? It's a competition, let's face it. It's the way the system is. So I can understand why they're acting this way. That doesn't make it the best way forward. And it's very important to reach out to all constituents. Here in Maine, I've been openly critical about our governor as far as addressing some of the protests that have happened in Augusta with small business people, right? And I thought, and I mean this only in the most constructive way, what an amazing gesture would it be if she would come out and just entertain some of these folks and listen to them. She'd take some heat for sure. Those rallies have been passionate. Spirit of full disclosure, I went to one a few weeks ago. I wanted to see what it was all about. But by and large, yes, she would have taken some heat, but I think those people would have been very receptive and appreciative, particularly if we listen. Now, we got to be very careful there, too, because sometimes a leader will come out, whether it's in politics or business, face the people, right, with courage, that's fine, but in order to explain themselves, right, or to rationalize. And it's very important as leaders that we go out just to listen. That's not always the place to, voice your opposition. Sometimes it means more to listen. And then people will appreciate, and most people understand it doesn't mean that their ideas are going to be heard, are going to be acted on, right? But at least they feel that their ideas have been considered. And I think that's a huge lesson our leaders should take forward. All of us,
Yeah, I think that it's the hardest thing to do for people is to shut their own mouths and just listen. Everybody wants to be heard.
Especially if you care, right? Especially if you're passionate. And
Exactly.
that's the flip side of it. You have to give people, when people are criticizing the intentions, you have to be very careful too. I don't believe for a minute our governor or others are bad intended. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. I want to share with folks. So Jim has written this beautiful book, and it's not brand new now, but the Sensei Leader. And do you mind if I read a couple of passages?
I'd be honored.
Because right now, what you're just talking about really strikes a chord, and it's about, and again, not political, but about leaders actually being leaders and stepping forward. And you have a chapter kind of in the middle of the book, and it's called Compassion. And you say that the good folks at Gallup asked 10,000 people what qualities they want and feel are most important in leaders. No big surprises, you say. Here's what they want: compassion, trust, stability, hope. People want leaders who care about them. People respond much better, work harder, produce more, and create more new ideas when they know that their leaders care. When people have faith in leadership, they're more ambitious, courageous, and innovative. They're more loyal, vested, and committed. And I think that speaks directly to what you were just talking about. And so I guess I wonder, during this time look, you flip on the TV and there were huge and sometimes violent, protests that are going on. There are many, many peaceful protests that are going on, being met with the National Guard. But let's get beyond that and talk about, what is the vision for true leadership? What are you talking about with, in your daily Zoom calls? Because you're talking to people all over the world. And so, and you're talking with leaders, I know you have great friends who are heads of trucking companies. And, they've been kind of the frontline heroes, not just kind of, but in a big way, because they've brought supplies and food to so many people. So I'm wondering, take us to some of those calls, if you would. What's the conversation been like? And kind of, I want you to kind of encapsulate it. It's been kind of a rigorous 3 months. And so what's the pattern been like?
It has. There's a bunch of issues, really, and it's ironic because you asked, where we were Zooming, and of course we use that kind of as the catch-all, right? Whatever platform. I don't want to give people the impression we're promoting necessarily just Zoom, right? There's a lot of these.
True. Thank you. Yes.
But
it's like Xerox, right?
Right. Exactly. We just did a meeting with some of the leaders that we support in Kenya, for example, and I have to say that in different parts of the world, the challenges are remarkably the same. I know we've had a lot of attention to pay to the riots, and I just wanted to mention very quickly too, yes, it's important, who you are as a leader becomes reality in the hearts and minds of the people that you serve, largely through what you say and how you say it. And we could spend all day going into, how people make mistakes that way. And we all do. Again, when I'm saying this, please understand, this is from a clinical perspective. I can't escape it in my life. This is what I study. This is what I preach. So, I have to be I have to be blunt about it. And when we have current examples, those are important. Those are teaching moments, not to be trite about it.
Right.
When we've heard words about the National Guard, I heard an interesting perspective on that. Right now, people have issue with policing, particularly in the urban areas, right? So the idea between bringing the National Guard in, I thought this was from cooler heads, is because they're a more disinterested party, and people
Okay.
can approach that different ways, right? But the National Guard's people themselves may not be as vested in that conflict as the police themselves. You see what I'm saying? So it could be, if it's handled right, it could be a calming influence. And the reason I'm saying that is because that brings up the complexity of these situations. It's very easy. People have, internet courage, right? We all have a voice. We can all get out there and bloviate and just rant and rage about a particular point of view. But these situations are very nuanced. And part of that compassion you just talked about, and compassion is not necessarily kindness. We get into that a lot in our live events. I mean, that's sometimes you have to be cruel to be kind and strong. Compassion means strength, not weakness.
Mm-hmm.
What it means is a deep sense of empathy, a discipline of empathy. I'm going to emphasize that. This is not something, it's simple, but it's not something that's easy for us to do all the time. We have to discipline ourselves to reach out and understand the other person. Like I said, doesn't necessarily mean we agree. And it certainly doesn't mean we condone if we're seeing behavior that we don't appreciate. But to understand, because we're not going to get to resolution without understanding. That's it, unless you're willing to all out commit to force, right? I won't be Pollyannish about it. You can do that. You can commit all out to force and get something done. Is that the way you want to go? And again, whether it's politically or in business, because it happens in business too, doesn't it? Whether people threaten others, impose draconian quotas, whatever the situation might be.
It happens in families too, Jim.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly, right?
think about
Exactly.
that.
And right,
Discipline.
that's the root of abuse in families,
Mm-hmm.
right? What's abuse? It's an imposition of force. People
Right.
trying to impose their will through force. That's dictatorship, not leadership. Force, fear, and coercion are dictators' tools. So you got to be very careful when we cross into that line. And those are some of the concerns people have been expressing in business, because things have been having to change so rapidly, right? We've been having to make transitions so rapidly. And as leaders, we've got to be very careful. Still want to take the time to pause, right? And solicit input from all levels. Everyone who might be impacted by those decisions, get the input. The people on the front lines might have better intel than the people who are in the C-suite, who are in the corner offices. They're the ones whose hearts and hands are in the work, right? And by soliciting that input, you might understand some challenges that are very small and manageable, and you address them before they become big crisis or disasters or situations that you then have to turn around and, I hate the word buy in, get people to buy in, which has been one of the things people are saying. How do you get people to buy into this or that right now? Well, you shouldn't have to. If you were asking them in the first place, that's not just a clever play on words, but you ask them early and often, you're not going to have to buy in. Sometimes buy-in means you already made a decision without that input, right? And now you're trying to sell it. And hey, nobody likes to be sold. The other big issue, really, like I said, uncertainty and struggling with that command and control mode. We can all slip into it, and you got to be very careful, because if you don't have the respect, the trust, and loyalty of the people you serve, when you do have to go into, out of urgency, some command mode, they're not going to follow you. What do? They rebel, they push back, and that's what we're seeing, on a kind of a global level across the country.
Well, and a lot of it, I think, is that, people have to have a place to put all of this. There is a lot.
Mhm.
There is a lot. And people, that's the place where they're putting it, is in the streets. We, Reggie and I, and you may have known him as well, but we lost a dear friend this week who was a very big leader in the immigrant community in Portland, Maine, Alain Nahimana. And he started the Greater Portland Immigrant Welcome Center, and he was a guest of ours on this show. And Alain's, boy, what a giant, an incredible leader. And his focus was on, you're not going to get anywhere, and what he would say is, you're not going to get anywhere with protests. You've really got to get places with policy. And so, he was a very, just a brilliant mind, and just such a great speaker. And we lost him way too young this week. We're going to talk more about that later, but we're talking about policy, and you mentioned uncertainty. And I wanted to read now something else in your Sensei Leader book, because you do talk about uncertainty. And it's, I believe it's the 5th chapter, and you say, be flexible, adaptable, and comfortable with uncertainty. Be prepared for every possibility and contingency. Be receptive to the rapid flow of new information and rapidly changing conditions. Be willing to act quickly to exploit new opportunities. Learn from the past, but embrace the power of change. So and again, we're not being political, but we have to right now. We have to kind of talk about this piece of it. And you had mentioned dictatorship. George Will had a big article the other day in the New York Times. And there are people talking about that piece. And when do we look at things, and with leadership in general, and I'm not just talking about way up high, but to your point about business leaders, and when do you know that it's time for change, and how do you claim that change? And when do you pull in a leader? And this again might be a family member who's not being efficient, not doing their job as a leader. How do you work with that?
The short answer is, you said, when are you prepared for change should be always, right? One of the questions we're getting a lot right now is, how should we be leading during this crisis? And one of the answers I've been giving is, you should be leading the same way you've always been leading, if you're leading the right way. Does that make sense? And I don't mean to be trite about that. I say that way to make a clear point. We shouldn't all of a sudden be changing our entire leadership strategy because we're in a crisis. If we're leading properly, if we embrace this idea of what we call human-centric leadership, that we're putting people first, that we're caring for people, and you just mentioned that earlier. The research is bomb-proof on that. People perform better. People perform at their best when and only when they know their leaders care, when their work has meaning, and they have a chance to learn and grow and develop. That's it. That's what the research shows us, has always, like we needed research to know this, right?
But we lose sight of things, though, right?
Right, exactly.
We do.
Exactly.
And it seems fundamental. It really does. It seems as easy as walking, but people lose track of that.
That's the difference between knowledge and practice, right? We have to discipline ourselves. It's easy to know things. It's very difficult to do them all the time. So at any rate, we should always be preparing and training. And for people who are going through something like this for the first time, we've been saying, you are preparing for the next one right now. And we have to make sure we give emerging and young leaders the opportunity to lead in a situation like this. Give them some responsibility, get them out there. Because the only way to be comfortable with uncertainty and the only way to develop courage is to expose yourself to it, right? That's the only way. There's no other way to it. You mentioned protest and policy, and that's an interesting thing to explore too. I'm all for protest. I really am. And it can influence policy. The problem is if people, and I believe probably this is what this gentleman may have been leaning towards too, without a meaningful dialogue that emerges from that, it's useless. Then it's useless. Right. Where we talk about people stepping up into leadership, is it enough to lead a protest? And I would say in most cases, no, it's a good first step. What are you going to do from there, right? What are you willing to do? And let's face it, a lot of times a protest can be a very engaging, a very exciting thing. And I don't mean for that to come out the wrong way. I hope that comes out the right way. When people
I think you mean it's like passionate. It is. I mean, it's a kind of an aggregation of people's passions, right?
And you're seeing that when you watch the video of some of these protests. People and people have been having a hard time wrapping their head around this. It looks like they're having a good time. Well, in a way, they are. You see, because they're expressing their compassion and because they're with like-minded people. That becomes, like I said, a very engaging, a very seductive thing. All right, now. Even in the worst situations, and you and I have been through some drastic ones, and we've found humor, we've found joy, we've found good moments in those times, right? And that's what you're seeing. Unfortunately, it gets exaggerated because we're seeing it in 10-second bits, right?
Right.
So at any rate, what are you going to do beyond that? That's the important question. Now that you've gotten people's attention, what are you going to do? And again, let's point to that story in Wichita. See, that's a great second step. Let's sit down and have the dialogue. Now, that's not enough, right? What's going to happen after that? Are we going to continue this dialogue? Are there going to be substantive changes, right, from the policy point of view? And are people willing to remain engaged long after this passion dies out?
Mm-hmm.
And are we going to continue the oversight? Because isn't it sad that these cycles aren't new? You said it earlier. We've been here. This is chapter what, you know? And
Too many to count.
too many. And hopefully, history's tough when you're living in it. It's tough to see it clearly when you're living in it. 200 years from now, people might read about this and say, wow, those people made some real progress. But we're not feeling that right now because we're in the middle of it.
Well, and I think that, I keep hearing people saying they're so fearful. They're fearful of the future. They're fearful of
That's
the end
natural,
of the
right?
world. They're here. They're fearful. I mean, you're hearing all of these almost prophecies type things forward.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think so you can comment on that. But I also the vision I had of what you were talking about having, that's not enough. That you've got to take it further. It's almost like a virtual blueprint that. You don't have to have it all on paper because, well, why would you? Because it's going to be changing, right? You can have a huge eraser, I guess.
Most of culture isn't on paper, right? Most of culture is not codified in
right.
law.
True. Although I do love old school paper, I have to say. There's something about writing, right?
Yeah.
I guess. I mean, that's been my life,
right?
As a writer, journalist, exactly.
Yeah.
But it's like this virtual blueprint, which is okay. Here's the first thing, and then who knew it was going to take such a sharp right, sharp left, and then that it's going to, if you allow it to, I guess it's going to be evolving as you go, and it's something that you wouldn't have, you can't know. It's not like a blueprint of a house. You don't know what the the whole end result is going to be. What do you say to people now? Who might be, budding leaders. I mean, truthfully, aren't we all leaders? Aren't we all?
I take a lot of heat for that. I say there are only two types of leaders. Two types of people in the world today: leaders and those who refuse. And I believe that with every fiber of my body. That, like I said, has nothing to do with rank or title or position. Okay, it has to do with how we conduct ourselves. Are we willing to provide an example? Are we willing to inspire and empower and guide the people around us? Help them accomplish more. That's what leadership is, okay? Hopefully, people in a position of authority are good leaders. We know that's not always the case, but each of us is capable of it. It's a choice, though. When people challenge me on that, they say, well, anybody can call themselves a leader. Well, that's true. Anybody can make you a manager. A certain number of people can elect you to an office, all right? But only the people you truly serve are the ones that can make you a leader. One person can make you a manager, right? And sometimes not for the right reasons, but only the people you serve can make you a leader. And they do that when you earn the respect, trust, and loyalty. Now, it isn't awful that those are thrown in that soft skills bucket, because to me, those are the most valuable assets any of us have as a leader: respect, trust, and loyalty. What can we possibly accomplish without it? You see? So, that's it. That's the most fundamental thing. That's what our entire focus on. You hit a couple of huge things we could probably talk all day on. First of all, the idea of transformation. I quote Pliny the Elder a lot, the old Roman philosopher. And he said, the only certainty is uncertainty. Sounds stupid when on the surface of it, but think about it. That's profound. The Asian masters that I studied would say it this way: the only constant in life is change, right? And the more we can embrace that, then the better off we'll be, the more comfortable we are in this uncertainty, and the more we'll be able to respond. And if there isn't, and I learned that from my transformation as a drug addict. Talk about
gosh, we haven't even talked about that, Jim. My goodness.
It was I'm not making light of the situation. It was a brutal experience. But having said that, that's where I started to learn to be more comfortable with uncertainty. Now, does that mean that I'm always, happy-go-lucky guy and everything's going to be great and I'm an optimist? Hell no. I mean, come on, let's be real. Life is tough. Life is painful. Comfort with uncertainty means that I just accept the fact that it is the way things are, and that the more I can accept that fact, then I'm able to keep my eyes, my ears, my heart open to opportunity instead of shrouding myself, like you said. And that is where the crossover is into the fear aspect. But we got to be very careful with that one too. The absence of fear isn't courage, it's stupidity, right? Fear is a survival mechanism wired into us. I think Nelson Mandela said it so beautifully, right? Courage is not the absence of fear, okay? It's our ability to embrace that fear and do what needs to be done. I'm paraphrasing a bit. Move forward,
Right.
right, in the face of that fear. That's what
But
courage
it's
is.
important to have that balance, right? That you
It
can
is.
you have that little bit of fear to know that no, you're not invincible, and you do,
Right.
there have to be limits and all of that,
Yeah.
but you also have to move outside of it and have the courage to listen and to reach out to other people. I want people before we
Well,
get too
and
far.
not let it control you, right?
Right,
Which is, I
right,
think, where you're getting at. When you let it control you, when you let the fear dictate your actions primarily, then you get to that isolation mode, or you get to the throwing rocks through windows.
glass windows, right, right.
Yeah. So it's, that's where we have to be very careful. And you said it earlier. And it's worth mentioning too. It's a very difficult thing to go down to. But I heard oh gosh, I'm not going to remember his name now. Very easy to find on the internet, on the YouTube. There's a man I believe he's from South Carolina. He's a musician. He's a black man who some years ago decided to try to understand the Ku Klux Klan a little more. And he took a lot of heat for this. He actually has made friends. He does a great presentation where he comes out and he actually has Ku Klux Klan robes. And when he first started doing this, people were very puzzled. Why is this guy doing Ku Klux Klan
Right.
robes? Well, it turns out by sitting down and dialoguing with these people, he has led now a couple of hundred people out of the Klan and out of that mindset. And he expressed that by sitting down, by listening, not by agreeing, not by condoning, right? But through understanding and getting past that fear. And one of the things he understood very, I think, rationally and intelligently, is that a lot of the people who are involved in those movements are involved out of fear, out of scarcity and out of fear. So when we have these groups that are acting this way, that's very often the root cause, isn't it? And until we understand those fears, why are these people afraid? Very difficult to lead through a resolution. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that it's an inherited fear, generationally speaking,
Can be.
and
Very deep too.
for many people that there just hasn't, no one's taken the time, as this gentleman did, to sit down and talk and figure it out. Like, why do you believe the way you do? Well, my father, my grandfather, my great
Exactly.
grandfather.
Exactly.
Jim, I want you to take the time to share with people, first of all, your website, your information. How can people get involved in your podcasts that you're doing? Because you're really interviewing a lot of really cool people. And, just, I love the discourse. I love the sharing that's coming out of it. It's really powerful.
Oh, I appreciate that. And it's cool because not everybody that I interview agrees with me. And I like that part of it.
That's I mean, but isn't
Yeah,
that the
yeah.
way life is supposed to be? We're supposed to learn from each other and push each other a little
Right?
bit so that we can, you know,
Yeah,
take a little bit more in, chew on it, think about
exactly.
it, and
It's
change our
neat to have
minds.
all the different perspectives because, especially in leadership, are often pressed, what leadership style is the best? I said, well, which one works in the time and in the place and with the people you're working with? So it's good to know a lot of different perspectives, right?
Well, it's also good to read your crowd, right? Read the audience.
That helps in my business.
All
Thank
right,
you.
give us your info.
The SenseiLeader.com is a good place to get all of that material. But I also want to say, just join the movement, the Sensei Leader movement. I mean, we're trying to bring people together. We are bringing people together from all over the world to share and support with one another. And the white belt membership is free, always will be. It's slmjoinfree.com. And right now, our black belt membership, which includes a live call every month, I think that's one of the most exciting parts of it. I believe that's still free for another few days. If not, I'll make sure your listeners get a link so that they can join free for a week or so.
It's interesting, your timing of all of this, because I know you were at this place at the end of the year, at the end of 2019, kind of not knowing what was coming ahead, and who knew that it was just like this train, coming through. And like you said, I mean, we've been discussing kind of this moving blueprint. It's developing as we go, and I guess that's the beauty of life, right? We just don't know what's coming down the path, and we have to kind of, as we did, we created this show all based on the pivot, the shift, and how you are working your way to navigate through kind of this fog of COVID, and now this whole Black Lives Matter, and now leadership, and just so many, and who knows what's coming down next. Let's leave people with some simple ways,
Mm.
simple ways that they can, kind of start grabbing hold of their own leadership.
You just hit the nail right on the head. And first of all, again, in spirit of full disclosure, you're right, a lot of uncertainty. I mean, most of my living was made speaking at conferences and doing workshops for companies and organizations. And that came to a grinding halt at the beginning of this COVID thing. To make the transition, I'll be honest with you, and I'm sure other people are feeling this. I had my moments, believe me. I'm for people in Maine, I'm half French Canadian. I can throw a fit with the best of them. But I try to keep it behind the curtain over there, right? And I try to keep it directed more at myself than at other people. But at any rate, yeah, in spite of that, we have to have our cry, we have to pitch our fit, and then start to take an inventory. That's the first step. What do I have to work with right here and right now? And that's tough. When revenue stops, how many friends we have in the restaurant business right now who are looking at just absolute disaster. But we have to look at what we have. And again, I learned that as a drug addict. I had very little. I didn't know day to day whether I was going to eat. My own fault. But poverty is poverty, whether you do it to yourself or not. And that's the first step, because whatever you're going to do from now on, you're starting right there. And by doing that, by being grateful for what you have, no matter how little, it helps us to focus on what we have rather than obsess over what we don't, if that makes sense, right? And like I said, a very proud, not attitude of gratitude. That's very practical because it's what you have to work going forward. The other part of it is you hit it simple. One of the big questions leaders have been asking us is, how do I inspire? It's our own fault. We promote that term very heavily and for good reason. But inspiration doesn't have to be grand. It's the small things you do every day. Leaders who are reaching out, just checking on their people. How are you doing? Is there anything I can do to make your life a little bit easier right now? These types of things. Example. There's nothing more inspirational than your example. Look what you and Reg are doing. And I know we covered this the first time. By stepping up and providing this platform, this forum, and sharing ideas. You could have easily said, I don't know, we're going to wait this out, see what happens. Instead, you guys in the middle of this chaos started this program. Okay? That's a simple step. You had the skills already, but how powerful is that, right? So instead of worrying about what you couldn't do, you focused on what you could do. And we can all do this, but it doesn't have to be grand. For God's sake, you don't have to be Martin Luther King. You don't have to step out and make the grand speech. Sometimes just a few words of kindness. And I'm sure you had this experience in your life. I mean, I believe we talked about that the first time. There's so many times in my life where just a few words to people that I only met for a few minutes, in my case, actually saved my life a couple of times or kept me out of jail, just because somebody took a couple of minutes and gave me a little guidance, a little encouragement, or sometimes a little slap in the head. But, right, they took the time.
Here, right.
Yeah. Sometimes compassion is a slap in the head.
Well, as they say, here's a trite thing, dare to care. I think wasn't that like something back in the 70s? Dare to care.
Yeah.
Like a public service announcement.
And if you don't care, don't bother, for God's sake. We encounter that sometimes. Someone who's entrenched in a mindset, well, people should do what I tell them to do because fill in the blank, right? No, if you don't care, don't bother, because it's not going to work. People are not going to respond.
It's true. It's absolutely true.
You might produce expected results, but you'll never go beyond that. What we're talking about means going beyond that, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love your wisdom. And when people watch us, they're going to be like, well, I want to see the first show because we've been mentioning it. So we may have to do that. But again, the reason why we didn't put it up was because we don't want to offend people, because we did it right before social distancing. And so we didn't want to confuse or send really the wrong message, because, I do wear my face mask. I do go out and wear my face mask. Not a political statement, but I'm just saying that we're all trying to do the social distancing thing and pay attention to the science of it all. And that's what I'll say right there.
We felt comfortable with each other. People should know that at that time, right? So,
yeah, we felt comfortable with each other.
It
was before that wall came down, but we have figured out ways to get around the wall, haven't we? And to go over the wall, or peek through the wall anyway.
I want no more wall, though, and I'm sure other people feel that way. We got to get back. I don't want any more walls. I want to give you a big hug.
Yeah, well, that would be a good thing. And many countries
Yeah,
have gotten to the place where they don't have any more deaths, and they
yeah,
have been able to do that. So I've got dear friends in New Zealand who
mhm,
are like, well, we're back to normal. How you guys doing?
yeah.
And so we're getting there. But
We'll get
Jim,
there.
I just again, is there any other way people could reach out to you? Do you have any other way that you'd want people to tune
I'm,
in?
I'm easy to find. You can Google me or I live on LinkedIn. You can,
Okay.
yeah, very easy to find me on LinkedIn. Yeah.
Good way to find Jim. Jim Bouchard, everybody, the Sensei leader. Jim, I just adore you and love having you on this show, and you know, your leadership matters. So thank you for sharing it, and keep up the great work during this COVID odyssey that continues.
Well, we appreciate you, Tori and Reg, for doing this program, and appreciate your leadership as well. That's what we all need to be doing. Just look at what we can do and go for it, right? Yeah.